Didn't turn that sharply. You can wake back up now. Okay, you know you've got issues when you have blackout and redout mechanics, and they don't always work properly. Okay, so today's Ancient DOS game is Evasive Action, a game I played the demo version of as a kid and chanced across a copy of the full version more recently. I always found it kind of weird that this game pretty much disappeared off everyone's radar not long following its release, but now that I'm able to play the full game, I completely get why this game is so unknown, though it is kind of difficult to explain concisely. Though, to be fair, this game is rocking some fairly unique features for what it is, given that it's a game from the early 90s with both modem-based multiplayer and split-screen multiplayer, a feature completely missing from the vast majority of 3D titles on the PC, modern games included. But beyond that, it has an unusual interface, a limited selection of aircraft for each time period presented, a huge number of bugs, and is one of the hardest games to get working on period-specific computers. Modern computers not so hard. See, this is probably one of the last commercial DOS games ever released to not use an external memory manager, such as DOS4GW, as this game has its own internal XMS handling. To that end, it still needs to put a lot of stuff into conventional memory, and ends up having one of the highest conventional memory requirements I've ever seen in a 90s DOS game, which is also using extended memory. As such, if you have less than about 580 kilobytes of free conventional memory, this game's not gonna run. And given the amount of stuff old DOS PCs were loading back then into the 640 kilobyte limit, like mouse drivers and things like that, getting this game working without a boot disk in a day and age when boot disks were starting to become a thing of the past made it kind of annoying and unusual to set up. Beyond all of that, the game is incredibly simple, so this probably won't make for a very long episode, but it should be an interesting one all the same, given how few people likely knew or remembered that this thing existed. Evasive Action was developed primarily by Glyn Williams, going under the business name Particle Systems, and was published in 1993 by the Software Toolworks in the Americas, and by Mindscape in Europe. It's a 1 to 2 player combat flight simulator, sort of, featuring VGA 320x200 256 color graphics and support for AdLib and Sound Blaster audio. I should note that you need a Sound Blaster card to get all of the game's sound effects, as the AdLib provides for engine sounds and the music, but the Sound Blaster is used for things like missile launches and explosions. As for its current release date, it's still commercial and is a bit tricky to find due to its fairly limited release. At the same time, though, there's virtually no demand for it, so when you do find a copy, it'll probably be fairly cheap. I couldn't find pricing on boxed copies, but loose copies tend to go for about $5 to $10. When you first start the game up, you're actually brought to a screen where you can choose which time period to play in. This affects which map you play on, as well as which aircraft you get access to. The time periods are meant to sort of translate into 4 different world wars, which is kind of an outdated concept now, as World War III hasn't really happened yet, and you can't call something World War IV when it doesn't even take place on the planet. Once you select a time period, you have to set up your options, as well as whether you're playing solo against a computer opponent, split screen with another player, or across a modem connection with another player. Now, setting up the options can be a bit weird, but basically, you have a sort of list of option sliders. You can scroll up and down the list with the up and down arrow buttons, then slide an option left or right with the left and right arrow buttons. It definitely takes a bit to get used to, but at least it works. You also have to keep in mind too that each time period saves its own settings, so each time you select a new time period, you'll have to go in and set up your preferred options again. And once your options are set, you can launch into your mission. Depending on the type of mission being flown, the players will either start at a specific common point, or will start at different spawn points. You then fly the mission until either you or your opponent wins. I'll talk about the different kinds of missions in a moment, but first, I want to address something interesting about this game and why I hesitated to call it a combat flight simulator. See, it's not really a simulation game. The physics model being used for the various aircraft is extremely basic. I mean, it makes sense from a control standpoint, but has no semblance of realism in the slightest. For instance, if you drop below your stall speed, you simply start losing altitude and your nose dips down on its own. Once you're above stall speed, this effect immediately ceases. You can't enter an uncontrolled spin, you can't perform any advanced maneuvers, there's no semblance of a flight envelope, and to top all of this off, there's virtually no controls. This is definitely more of an arcade game than a simulator, even though it's more appropriately grouped as a combat flight sim just from the nature of what you're doing in the game. That said though, one of the selling points was actually the simplicity of its design. In all 4 time periods, the controls are identical. You have one button which cycles your active command, and another button which uses that action. You also have throttle up and throttle down controls, a button to select your targeting mode, a button to change your camera view, and a button to toggle the camera view on the direction indicator. And that's pretty much it. There's no rudder controls, which makes trying to line up targets for your guns a real pain in the butt, especially in the space area which lacks gravity in the physics model and those controls more like Elite. There's no support for an actual throttle either through a more advanced joystick interface. And the game only supports 2 joystick buttons, so in that regards, you're going to be using DOSBox's key map or playing this on a modern system. But yeah, using guns, locking and firing missiles, even launching from an aircraft carrier or toggling the state of your landing gear, all of it is done by using a button to cycle the action and pressing the fire button to activate that action. This is most annoying for the guns since there's no auto fire, meaning you have to press the fire button for every individual shot you want to fire. But you can't simply use DOSBox's auto fire to compensate because you have to use that same fire button for everything else. I should also quickly point out that the maps are huge. There's a massive number of obstacles scattered across each map and quite a few obstacle designs for them as well. In fact, I'd almost go so far as to say that flying through these maps and exploring can be more entertaining sometimes than trying to actually play the game proper. Anyways, let's talk about the missions. There's 3 different types of missions you can fly: dogfight, race, and attacker. Dogfights are simply kill or be killed. You and your opponent will start some distance away from each other and have to close in to get in range of your guns. In the 90s era, you'll also have access to rear aspect IR missiles of some design, which will only properly track targets from behind and can be fooled with flares. While in the space era, you also get access to some more unusual weapons, such as an automatically locking laser or mines that you can actually lay behind you. If you run out of ammunition, you can fly through one of the many stunt boxes scattered around the world to rearm. Though if you take any damage, you'll have to make do until you or your opponent bites the dust, because there's no way to repair damage. Races have you and your opponent starting from the same point, and you have to fly through a fairly lengthy series of stunts to clear the race. If you're shot by your opponent, you'll simply be stunned for a moment, whereas if you crash out, you respawn back at the starting point, but your progress is not reset. So you can just fly up to the next stunt in your sequence and continue from there. Mind you, it can take quite a bit of time to get that far after crashing, so if you do crash, you're pretty much going to lose the race unless your opponent crashes the same number of times or more. The attacker missions, on the other hand, these are just plain dumb. It's meant to be like a game of tag where you earn points based on how quickly you can tag an opponent with your guns while it, and doing so will make your opponent it and have to tag you. And the trouble is that the 2 aircraft choices for each time period are so similar in function that once one person has enough of an advantage to get a tag, if they're smart about how they're flying, they'll almost certainly just stay right in the blind spot of their opponent the entire time their opponent is it. That way, when time runs out and you become it again, you can just immediately start shooting. It's a good idea in theory and would certainly work a lot better with more aircraft, but for one-on-one, it just isn't any fun. Yeah, there's really nothing more to say about this thing, since you only get 2 aircraft per time period and the bugs are more random and annoying than catastrophic or easy to exploit or trigger. Actually, no, wait, there is one more thing I can quickly show you guys. I found screenshots of the game's map editor UI buried within the rest of this game's graphics. But as far as I can tell, no editor's actually included. But seriously, if that editor was included, this game would have sold a lot better and probably would still be remembered to some degree. As it stands, it's just a buggy, arcade-style flying game with really simple objectives and a severely limited number of things to do. The graphics aren't bad, and I really like that all 4 music tunes for each time period are reminiscent of each other, but really, this game doesn't hold attention very well, and while I can't recommend people go rush out for a copy, I would say it's worth hunting down the demo version just to give it a try. Or if you do like these kinds of games and such, and you can find a disc for cheap, then yeah, give it a shot. But again, don't expect much more than about a half hour or so of entertainment. Setting this game up in DOSBox isn't too challenging, but there is the problem of some of the ad-lib sounds being completely messed up. I tried testing a whole bunch of settings, but nothing I tried had any effect. So unless you're playing on real hardware or muted, you're going to have to live with some of those weird engine sounds and such. Other settings you need to set are fixed cycles count that's not too low but not too high. I recommend 50,000. You need to set the CPU core to dynamic mode manually since the game uses its own internal memory handler. And when using a joystick, you have to turn off timed intervals and should probably turn button wrap off as well so you can map buttons beyond the 4th one to keyboard keys. Anywho, that's all for this episode of Ancient DOS Games. Next week's a filler, and I'm kind of debating what to do at the moment. If you guys have any ideas, be sure to send them to adg@pixelships.com, and make sure to stay tuned because there's only 5 more regular episodes left for the year, and there's still some really interesting stuff in store for you all. Thanks for watching, everyone, and special thanks to those of you supporting me on Patreon. Here's just a small sample of you guys.
Captain Neil Lasher Columbus, form command. I think that was a single enemy dreadnought in orbit glowing about the entire thing. Our cruisers blast through this ship across the solar system. I got a funny feeling there's more around the area, and given our distance from Earth, that ain't exactly a good thing. Battle, but damn it all the same. If we have to fend off attacks, we're gonna eventually exhaust our resources. I know, we'll do what we can.